Tom, I know you were talking this morning about Peter Trent's column in the Montreal Gazette, and we use this as our question of the day with some very interesting calls from people. I want to just play this clip and then have you weigh in on what he did have to say. Brian?
The average Montreal elected official is making $165,000 a year. What we should be doing is paying what the market says you're worth. Because right now we pay people, regardless of their background, regardless of their education, regardless of their experience, the same amount of money.
Okay. He made the point. He did a serious deep dive into the city's finances and found this information 350 pages into it. But we also took calls from people like Michael, for example, who said, wait a sec, if everything was perfect, if everything was running the way it's supposed to be running, that's fine. But it isn't, and it's never been. So I'm curious what your take on this, as a former politician, is.
Well, I don't think you can, if that's what Peter was hinting at, and I really like Peter Trent, but I think if he was hinting, and I think that was his point, that maybe not everybody should be paid the same, that doesn't work. Because if you're doing the same function and you've been elected to it, everybody has to get the same pay. Otherwise, people with long curriculum vitae would wind up being the only ones who would want to get elected because anybody else would not really be paid for the job. So I don't think that would work if that is indeed what he's saying, and I don't want to put words in his mouth. But what I would say is this, that we're paying far too much in Montreal for what we're getting. I mean, that's the whole point. Mm-hmm. We have 1,800 managers. I mean, everybody was upset in the fall when it was announced that all 1,800 managers were getting a nice big bonus, but my jaw dropped to learn that there were 1,800 managers in Montreal. That's the beginning of the problem. The other thing that Trent comes up with, and there are some interesting comparisons in there, is you compare what people make for the same job in the private sector or in the provincial government. And so this points to the lax renegotiation of contracts at the municipal level. Compare Montreal cops' salaries to the Sûreté du Québec, but there are municipalities in Quebec that are much smaller, not nearly as difficult as Montreal, where they're making a lot more. I remember the bus driver's contract, and I was an M&A up in Laval, and I remember watching the renewal of a bus driver contract and learning that the bus drivers, and I'm going back more than 20 years, were making over $100,000 back then. And so I'm sort of going, I don't think that's market. So I talked to the owner of one of the bigger private bus companies. I said, well, what does a really, hardworking, driver make? He says, well, if a guy's really, taking all the shifts he can, he's going to make $45,000, maybe 50. Wow. And this is at the same time. So that's still a decent salary back then. It would be a lot more today. But with regard to the public sector salaries, in the province of Quebec at the provincial level, it's far too low. Nurses are way underpaid mm-hmm. compared to the Canadian average. Mm-hmm. Teachers are grossly underpaid compared to the Canadian average, and much, much less than our sister province in Ontario. And this is what Legault's trying to handle right now. He's not doing a very good job of it, frankly.
The argument always comes up, and we heard that from a caller as well, municipally anyway, which is what Peter Trent was talking about. The fact that we have too many elected officials, and you're mentioning managers, we have too many of those as well, right? How does that ever change?
I mean, Montreal's governance, Montreal's structure is an octopus. I mean, they're just arms all over the place. You've got the boroughs here, and you've got this thing. And I remember just trying to figure it out when I was in federal politics as all of this was rolling out. I have to plead guilty because I was part of Jean Charest's government that tried to pick up the broken pieces from the work, if that's such as the word, that the Parti Québécois had done. They'd wanted to merge all of Montreal, the whole island. And then places like Montreal West and Beaconsfield and Côte-Saint-Luc and Westmount, Peter Trent's town, and others were just saying, no, we have nothing to do with it. So they were able to pull apart. So now you've got the Swiss cheese. You've got those towns that are getting really hammered on the taxes for services that they don't get. And the octopus that's been in place for Montreal, I mean, there are pieces that just don't make any sense. But it was compromise after compromise after compromise, and we've got one of the most unwieldy structures that I can think of anywhere in the Western world to handle a major city.
So the question I asked earlier, I think I'm not sure I asked Peter that, does this ever change? Can it ever be changed? Can you ever put that genie back in the bottle?
Well, not when you have that Swiss cheese, because you've got the Gdansk corridor out in the West Island, because you have certain populations that voted to become towns again and be independent. Then you have little parts of Montreal that are sort of barely attached to the rest of Montreal. So it's really quite difficult what we've come up with. It's an amazing mess that we managed to create, because when we were there with the Liberals, we never had the guts to simply say, okay, we're just going to allow people to demerge. So we came up with this rule that there had to be a certain percentage of people actually taking part in the vote. So there were places where a clear majority of those who took the trouble to vote wanted to get back their town. But then we had invented out of nowhere this rule. I believe it was 30% had to vote in these things, which is a pretty high number in anything to do with municipal politics. So we're stuck with it right now. I don't see anybody wanting to ruin their career by throwing themselves on this particular grenade of the disorganization of everything to do with public management in Montreal. But that doesn't mean you don't negotiate your collective agreements properly. It doesn't mean that you give bonuses automatically to all 1,800 managers. I mean, that has nothing to do itself with management.
So Peter Trent also was sort of saying that people should go into politics because they feel compelled, because they feel, driven at the call. And I was like, that's fine and dandy, yes, ideally, but it also has to make financial sense.
Well, exactly, because you're really like, I know Peter well, and I really do like him. I think he's one of the smartest people who's ever graced the political world at any level. But I also know, for having done it for years, like even though Quebec City is only a few hours up the road, you're putting in massive sacrifices with regard to your family life, your personal life. And yes, you chose it, and you're doing it precisely because you want to serve and you want to help the community. But I don't think that we should be too rough. But I think the biggest mistake we made with regard to the increase in the salaries of the members of the National Assembly, or at least it was a boneheaded move by Legault. He should have waited a year once he'd gotten past his collective, his negotiations of his collective agreements. Doing it when he did it, every single nurse and every single teacher who's putting up with a class full of kids who don't have proper help, they're just pointing to the 30%, saying, "Hey, buddy, stuff it,"
So meanwhile, Pierre Poilievre is in Montreal right now. It's the first day of Hanukkah, and he's at that synagogue that was firebombed for the lighting of the first candle. Your piece in ctvnews.ca today, your piece on that website, rather, says Poilievre keeps scoring into the Liberals' empty net. I don't see that changing anytime soon. You, Tom?
Well, I do know that Trudeau's hiring a new communications team, but they seem to be completely, to stay with the French, dépassé, by all of the events around them. So, for example, when Poilievre came up, it was a sterling piece of political communication. There's a lot of stuff in it that you can pick apart, but his thing on housing hell was a bit of political communication on a level that I've never seen here in Canada. The last time I saw anything anywhere close to that was when Pierre Poilievre pretended he was sitting down having breakfast with Pierre Trudeau in front of him. Of course, Trudeau wasn't there. Mm-hmm. And he was pointing to the increase in the cost of butter and the cost of eggs and so forth. So it's just, this guy's got a knack, and he's got a really, really good young team around him. He's got the guts to do it, right? And so what Trudeau tried to answer, they tweeted a PDF of like a couple of hundred pages from the Fall Economic Update from Chrystia Freeland, and that was supposed to be their whiz-bang answer to this incredible piece of communications that Poilievre had just put out there. So you just slap your forehead and say, okay, you have every resource that the government has. You could be running ads about your Fall Economic Update. Harper did it every year to the tunes of tens of millions of dollars. Legault spent $100 million on self-aggrandizing publicity since he got there, and that doesn't seem to get anybody riled up. So why don't you have the skill to actually talk about yourself? I think the answer to that, the short answer, is that Trudeau always felt that he was enough. He was going to emote his way through everything and cover everything, and then he realized that it's not even the same race. He's full of energy. I remember what he did to Jean Charest. Charest is no slouch when it comes to politics. He's a heck of a good politician. But when I saw him in the race against Poilievre, it was like a Tyrannosaurus Rex eating a bunny rabbit. There was no, they weren't even in the same league.
Look, I was going to say, if you kind of put this in the same category, sports, what they should do is sign, Pierre Poilievre's communications team, because they did such a great job with this, and steal him away. But that's obviously not going to happen.
No, because they're very dedicated. Yeah. This is a movement. These are devotees. They're zealots.
Sure.
They think that they're carrying a holy flame. But by the way, this is where they could flame out, because I think that their reach exceeds their grasp right now. I think they're pushing their luck. They're overplaying their hand. So this whole thing, we're going to filibuster this, and we're going to keep the House sitting through the Christmas holidays and blah, blah, blah. Really? You think that that's going to garner you support in the wider public? The public is getting ready for a break. We want a holiday. We want to see Legault settle with the teachers and the other unions. We want to see Parliament come back in January with more reasonable things to do. But Poilievre wants to keep the fight going. And his Rudy Giuliani through all of this is Andrew Scheer. Scheer lights his hair on fire regularly. He wants to fire Greg Ferguson. They're going to filibuster that. And then they want to get rid of the carbon tax for farmers because they hope that'll draw in some support for them. So they're going to filibuster that. People want ho, ho, ho. They don't want pirates going arg. And I think that our friend Poilievre is going to learn that at his own expense.
All right.